I always wanted to do that. Okay, we're gonna get started. Just some housekeeping items before we get going. I've been asked, since we are filming this live webcast, that keep your phones away from the microphones, as they will interfere with that. And then I'm not sure why the reason for this. We've also been asked to remove our visitor badges. So if you would not lose them, but take them off, that would be great. Okay, thanks. And before we get started as well, I want to thank DHS staff for having arranged our lunch for us as well. I understand that was quite a Herculean task with the White House mess. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So let's get started. I'm Mark McLaughlin. I'm the CEO of Palo Alto Networks, and I'm the NSTAC Vice Chair. As you're aware, Maggie Wilderrader, our chair, had to take off to be a commencement speaker for university this afternoon, so she's left the meeting in my hands, so hopefully I'll do a good job with that. I'd like to thank you for being here today at the 2014 annual NSTAC meeting. It's a pleasure to see everybody. I'd like to recognize several of our distinguished government partners participating today, including Michael Daniel, who's not here but will be shortly, but we've all seen him already. He's the Special Assistant to the President and Cybersecurity Coordinator. Dr. Phyllis Schneck, who is in the hallway and will be with us, but I want to keep us on time, so we're starting anyway. She's the Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity at DHS. Mr. David DeVries, who is here, thank you, David, Acting Chief Information Officer for the Department of Defense. Really appreciate you guys being here, and also David Gelfand from the Department of Justice, who will have some remarks for us in a little bit. In addition, I wanted to welcome our international partners who are with us here today. About a year ago, one of the ideas we had was to try to extend on an international basis an understanding of what may be happening outside the United States for something similar to NSTAC. So is there such a thing, outside the United States? And if so, where? What does it look like? And how does that work? And over a year's worth of effort with DHS staff, again, thank you for that. We've been able to put this together this afternoon, so we're going to have a panel on that. And with us today, we have Mr. James Quinall, who is from the UK Office for Cybersecurity and Information Assistance. In essence, is the Michael Daniel of the UK. Mr. Rhys Bowen from that office as well. Mr. Martin Prue from Industry Canada, which is the very equivalent as well. And Mark Duchesne from Bell Canada is with us as well. And we'll hear from all these guys later, as well as Mark Hughes from BT Security. So we've got a full agenda this afternoon. We're going to start off with this panel discussion that will engage the representatives from the United Kingdom and Canada to see what the similarities and differences may be from NSTAC. We're hoping that that's going to start off something we could continue with, which might be an increased collaboration for NSTAC on an international basis to learn what's happening and also to share what's happening outside of the U.S. Following the panel, we're going to get an update from Dr. Schneck on the government's progress on some of the NSTAC reports and recommendations that have already been accomplished. And then we're going to finish off the afternoon with discussing our current NSTAC activities. Bill Swanson's going to provide an update on the Internet of Things subcommittee, and then Glenn Post will also lead a discussion, and we will have a vote as to whether to move forward or not on the Information Technology Mobilization Subcommittee report. So at this time, I am going to turn it over to David Gelfand from the DOJ. He's going to give us a quick briefing on some of the antitrust issues that we've probably read about related to cybersecurity.
Thanks, Mark. My name is Dave Gelfand. I'm a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Antitrust Division, and I've been asked to say a few words about antitrust guidance in connection with the sharing of information. And I know a lot of you are accustomed to antitrust briefings. This one's going to be very short and very positive, so I hope you'll appreciate that. Some members of the business community had, on occasion, expressed concerns that sharing of information about cybersecurity might give rise to antitrust issues. On April 10th, 2014, the Justice Department Antitrust Division and the FTC issued a joint policy statement on this topic. The policy statement makes clear that sharing of cyber security information such as incident reports, indicators, threat signatures, and alerts does not raise antitrust concerns at the agencies. The sharing of such information among private entities is an important component of securing our IT infrastructure and has the potential to greatly improve the safety of our systems. Such sharing of information is already taking place, both informally and through formal exchanges, or agreements such as sector-specific information sharing analysis centers, and it can take various forms, unstructured or very structured, human to human, or automated. Regardless of the form, our recent guidance recognizes that sharing this kind of cybersecurity information is well within the range of beneficial conduct that does not run afoul of the antitrust laws. It can improve efficiency and help secure networks of information and resources. The nature of the information is very technical and not competitively sensitive, like pricing or output information. And it is unlikely in itself to increase the ability or incentive of companies to raise price or reduce output, quality, service, or innovation. The guidance can be found on our website and on the FTC's website. We also stand ready to provide further guidance through our business review process if particular issues arise that are not covered by the general guidance. We recognize the shared interest this administration and the business community have in cooperating to combat cybercrime. The antitrust enforcers are glad to do their small part in advancing that goal. And I'm happy to answer any questions if people have them at this time. Please.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. This is very interesting, and I think it's helpful to the community, but there has to be some aspect of this that DOJ looked at. I mean, companies can get together and trade information in the area of cybersecurity. That could be destructive. How does DOJ view that particular initiative?
So I'm not sure I follow the question. You're saying that there could be sharing of cyber threat?
I mean, you have cyber information. Two companies can get together to share cyber information that ultimately results in a destructive measure. I'm sure DOJ has to not think kindly of that.
You mean destructive of competition, or?
Ultimately, that would be the case.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we have looked at the kinds of information that are shared for the purpose of improving cybersecurity. Things like incident reports, threat signatures, those sorts of things. And those are the kinds of information that I think do not raise antitrust issues. If the information sharing goes beyond that, if there's sharing of pricing information, for example, then you get into the more traditional realm of antitrust. But I'm assuming for the purpose of these remarks that we're talking about the sharing of technical information that's used to improve security.
Well, those are relatively benign type of information with respect to antitrust, and I do agree. But I think it's still a wide door, you know, that needs to be looked at in all aspects.
Even beyond antitrust?
Even beyond. No, not with respect to antitrust. You need to look at it. But these incidents, or like incident report and so forth, they're pretty benign items. But, you know, in a period of big data, you know, you can put all this together and come up with a good hypothesis and target a particular industry with respect to this information. The question I am really asking is, has DOJ looked at that particular aspect of this information sharing platform?
A broader aspect that would involve something beyond, I apologize.
Yeah. Okay, let me make it simple. Again, cybersecurity is a broad field, a broad area. You're talking about sharing information among companies and the fact that such sharing will not imply antitrust. My concern is that that's too broad, because there is information in that arena that once put together by two companies could lead to an antitrust situation. Has DOJ looked at those particular instances?
So we have not identified that particular example that you just hypothesized. We're obviously open if people want to inform us about issues that might arise with the combination of certain types of information. We're always open to hear about that. We do have a business review process. If people are concerned that the sharing of particular information might in some way reduce competition, then we would be delighted to hear about that and provide our guidance on a particular example. I think it's hard for me to answer in the abstract. But the types of information sharing that we've looked at and thought about I think leads us to give broad guidance that, as a general matter, it is not an issue. It's often said that antitrust is very fact-specific and case by case, and that's true here, like anywhere. But for the kinds of information, the kinds of technical information that we've looked at, we don't see an antitrust issue there.
Please.
David, how would you all feel about an association doing that? Is that an easier thing to do when members could do that rather than a few companies getting together?
I think it can be more effective and more controlled when it's done pursuant to a central organization, whether it's an association or a third-party vendor, and I think they can be very helpful. Our guidance is not limited to that situation, but where it is done through a formal organization, rules can be established, somebody can be appointed to oversee the process, and that can often work more efficiently. I agree with that.
Other questions or comments for David?
So, Mark, what did you say, since Michael has obviously been delayed? We asked David to come here and give you all a brief on DOJ's guidance as a means to tee up what we hope would be a discussion of this subject, a more in-depth discussion at the November meeting. So the hope is that DOJ has put out this guidance, and 6 months from now, we would like to come back to you and ask you, how would you react? Has this made a difference for you? Has this helped alleviate some of the barriers that you cited to sharing information? So I'd like you to just think about that and plan that. We're going to ask you that question again in November, just to see has this made an impact. So that's what we would ask the community to take up 6 months from now.
Thanks, Sherry. And I know we've talked quite a bit about in sharing information, there are a number of obstacles to that, like liability, legal obstacles, and the attempts to address each one of those. And I think this is the beginning of one of them where there's been antitrust concerns or issues raised in the past. So thank you very much, David. We appreciate your time. Great. Okay, so with that aside, we're going to start with our panel discussion, but I have to read a little disclaimer here first. I have to remind everyone that this meeting is open to the public. Please be mindful not to discuss any classified or otherwise sensitive information. And additionally, as you know, we are a federal advisory committee governed by the Federal Advisory Committee Act. One of the provisions within the Act provides members of the public with an opportunity to provide comments and feedback on the NSTAC activities for our consideration. Although we provided an opportunity for the public to register comments, no individuals responded, and therefore we will move on to the business at hand. Marshall, other way. Great. So I'd like now to turn our attention to our international guests, and again, thank them all for taking their time out of their busy schedules to be with us here today, especially the folks who traveled quite some ways, I understand, for a one-day trip to Washington, D.C., so thank you very much for doing that. And we'll hear today from representatives from Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States on their country's approaches to protecting critical infrastructure that may have national security and emergency preparedness implications. But before we start off with the panel, the way I intended to do that was questions and answers. I have a few questions for the folks, and I was hopeful that we could go from there as a group and explore what's similar and different outside the United States. But before I get started with that, I want to give the government representatives an opportunity to provide some introductory remarks by way of introduction. Also, if you could, I'd love to introduce yourself, the organization you're with, and if you could just tell us briefly what are the top topics that are, coming to mind for you right now as things you work of, and any of the similarities or differences, since I think you're fairly familiar with NSTAC. How's it similar? How's it different from what's going on in your country? I'll start with you, James Quinault from the UK.
Thank you, Mark. I'm James Quinault. I'm the Director of the Office of Cybersecurity in the UK government. My office helps UK government ministers set strategy on cybersecurity and marshals UK government status behind that strategy. We obviously also work very closely with the private sector, and I'm pleased to have my colleague and friend Mark Hughes from British Telecom here. We do have an exact equivalent of the NSTAC. It's called the Telecom Industry Security Advisory Council. Its remit goes beyond cyber security, but in practice in recent years it's spent most of its time talking about those issues. In terms of the priorities of my office, those are to deliver on the themes and lines of development set out in our government's cyber security strategy, which was published back in 2011. Briefly, those are to build up the UK's national sovereign capability to detect and defeat the high-end threats, to work with the providers of our national infrastructure to make sure that they're properly protected, to work with broader business to raise its awareness of these issues, but also make sure that they're properly protected, and in particular that they're pooling information and situational awareness so as to make them stronger. We're working with the public to raise public awareness of the threat, so that people do what they can to protect themselves, but also demand for better security in products and services that's driven up. We're obviously investing in skills and research so that the UK has the people and the cutting-edge techniques it needs to keep pace with this problem into the medium term. And finally, of course, we're working with international partners to build capacity, bear down on what would otherwise be havens for cybercrime, and establish the norms of behaviour in this government space.
And as far as working with industry, we have about, at any given time, 25 to 30 members of the NSTAC that are from industry. What does it look like?
So we're slightly smaller, but then slightly smaller as a country. I think there are about 50 members of the committee, supported by a working group of points of contact who will work as using in between meetings and make sure the agenda is carried through.
And a mix out of telecommunications and other verticals?
Principally our large telecoms providers.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And Martin, maybe you could tell us a little about Canada.
Thanks for having us. Thank you. So I'm Martin Prue. I'm the acting DG, or Director General, in the engineering branch of, it's a long title, of the Spectrum and Information Technologies parts of Industry Canada. So in Canada, public safety is the equivalent of DHS. It sets the overall strategy. There's a recognition of 10 different critical infrastructure sectors, more or less equivalent, different grouping than what's used in the US and in the UK. And within these 10 sectors, there's one sector that's a bit different from the US. It regroups communications and IT together in terms of ICT. And it's the responsibility of Industry Canada to look after advancing cybersecurity issues for the ICT critical infrastructure sector. So as part of that objective, 4 years ago, so it's a much shorter history than the long history of NSTAC, but 4 years ago we assembled a CSTAC, C for Canada, and we have about 12 of the major telcos at the table. And so we have an obvious ongoing dialogue when it comes to cooperating and exchanging information and trying to advance the agenda of protecting Canada's critical infrastructure.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And also, I'm going to introduce Mark Shane from Bell Canada. Maybe you can give us a little bit of your background, Mark, and
Sure.
your involvement.
Sure, thank you for having us. Privileged to be here. So my name is...
Could you ask, the acoustics are really bad in this room, so...
I'm sorry, what'd you say? No.
Could you
Yes.
just take it up a notch, because we're having a hard time hearing you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll start this over and speak into the mic a bit more. Is this better?
It's a mic thing.
Okay. So my name is Mark Duchesne. I'm Chief Security Officer for Bell Canada, basically responsible for the company's security strategy, all aspects of security, whether it's physical investigations, fraud, network security, information security. Happy to be here, and of course working closely with colleagues that are here around the table, whether it's BT, Verizon, AT&T, and other folks on a regular basis as we advance our business.
Great, thanks, Mark. And Mark
So
Hughes?
I'm Mark Hughes. I'm from British Telecommunications, and we are a big carrier that we operate in 170 countries. So I'm responsible for all matters to do with security across BT, right through from physical and into information security, which is my primary concern. And I think, Mark, just picking up on what you asked, the main points of concern that I have at the moment is clearly ensuring that we provide the commensurate level of protection that our customers request and require from us in terms of the information that they entrust to us and how we protect that. And I would say also the other key area of concern is ensuring that we are ahead as much as we can be through ensuring that we have the information so that we can be in a position to be, as I said, ahead of the game and become more proactive in what is a very, as we all know, very fast changing threat environment, especially in the cyber arena, and how we react to that and respond to that when sometimes those threats are not obvious and come up quite quickly, the so-called velocity of this type of threat is much different from perhaps some of the more traditional things that we've dealt with in the telecommunications sector. So that is probably my main area of concern at the moment.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. I was going to ask Reese if he could just introduce himself. So.
I'm Reese Bowen. I'm Deputy Director of Cybersecurity working for James. My role is I'm responsible for our Critical National Infrastructure Programme, which is basically along similar lines to the executive order work which is taken forward here in the US. Amongst my other responsibilities, I coordinate and chair the working group that supports the TISAC group to the UK equivalent of NSTAC.
Great, thank you, Reese. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
No, I was just going to maybe start off with just a question, primarily to Mark and James here in the room. I'm really curious. Curious in your countries, what are you finding is the best vehicle for creating public awareness of the public-private interlock that you are obviously engaged in? I mean, is there educational campaigns that you're doing? Is there press statements that you're making? Is there an overall campaign that you're launching, public safety, including cyber? I mean, I'm curious kind of what works and, if anything, what might you recommend?
Yep. Hey, Martin, you want to start?
Yeah, so in Canada, that responsibility is public safety department. They have a public-facing cyber awareness program, and it's I think it's done fairly well. There's always room for improvement. There's also room, and we've started discussions with respect to collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in those awareness campaigns. But I think we're still a bit early in terms of those discussions.
Do you broadcast like this in a public forum, in meetings and sessions?
No, we don't have a public forum like this in Canada.
Is your question about public awareness campaigns in general, or what we do to publicise what the government is doing with private sector?
Maybe a little both, Jake. I'm just curious, as you have these forums like NSTAC that we have here, how are you making the public aware of your initiatives, your strategies, perhaps, obviously trying to improve the mindset of the consumer to these types of interlocks that are occurring? Do you see anything successful that we could learn from on perhaps what you're doing?
So in terms of keeping people informed about our overall strategy, the original government strategy was published, and we published regular updates against that and the progress we've made. In terms of what we do about our equivalent of NSTAC, its agendas and minutes are publicly available if people want to see them. We film the meetings. This is a new experience for me. There's a limited page. In terms of public awareness campaigns more generally, this is difficult. It can be difficult to carry lots of messages through a campaign like that. And let's face it, some of this stuff is very boring. It can be hard to get people to listen. But we have tried. We have tried. We ran a campaign about a year ago now called Devils in the Details, which was an attempt using social media to get out some messages on this stuff, working with the brain and how we understood people receive messages on this. That was pretty successful. It reached 4 million people in the UK, which is good. The surveys afterwards, 2/3 of those we sampled said they changed their behaviour as a result, so that's quite impactful. Since then, we've been repeating that kind of approach. We're in the middle of a campaign now called the Cyber Streetwise, which is an attempt to get people to carry some of the things that are second nature to the need space into the internet arena. We're waiting for the tracker data on how well it's going across, but the early signs are reasonably good. But you can't turn people into sophisticated consumers of antivirus software using a campaign like this.
Personally, just a comment. I thought some of the programs that you've done, the Devil in the Details program and the Cyber Streetwise programs, are really genius. You don't see them anywhere in the world, I think, in the totality that you've done. So, at least my perspective as well. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah. So one thing I'd be interested in is hearing from Mark. And Mark, we kept this easy. If you were Mark, you got invited, to the meeting. If your name is Mark. But on working with your equivalent of the NSTAC, I'd be interested in views on what's worked really well, maybe not from the industry side of this, right? Because I think we have our views on here represented U.S. industry, but if you have any thoughts on that.
Me start?
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, things that have worked well, I think there is a very good, well, firstly, there's a very good framing in the UK around the risk itself. So, as James alluded to earlier on, the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and then from that, the National Risk Register, which singles out cyber as one of the key areas alongside a number of others, natural disaster, terrorism events, and the like. So we have a lot of guidance, if you want, to enable us to frame our risk approach to how we manage and deal with the risk from a carrier's perspective within the overall UK's national risk piece. And also, it's probably worth mentioning that clearly we get a lot of input from the European Union as well, and there are a number of things that are across all 27 member states where the European Union is heavily involved in issuing guidance and has issued guidance to operators across the European Union, the so-called Article 13, which is on network information security. So to start with, there's quite a lot of guidance that comes our way. Now, as industry, as many of us are in this room, sometimes that guidance can be helpful, sometimes it can be rather irritating. But broadly speaking, we do work in a very collaborative way to ensure that we get to a point which actually is useful. And I refer back to what I said earlier on. I think we're all clear, certainly from what I do in the UK, that the nature of the threat that we're facing is such that we have to be very agile in the way in which we approach this. So from the TSAC Council, the equivalent of NSTAC in the UK, there's obviously some ability there for us, first and foremost, to help shape and input into those very high-level policy-type direction things. So that I think works well. And indeed we have, as I'm sure this committee is indeed the same way, there is that input there that we can make sure that the overall guidance works. But as is the way in many of these things, clearly the operational level is clearly extremely important as well. So coming down a couple of notches to the day-to-day, really, cooperation and collaboration. So there are a number of forums, firstly. How do we take policy? How do we turn it into reality? So a few things come from that. There is the Department of Homeland Security equivalent, or semi-equivalent, we call it the Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure, which is responsible in the UK for policy around national infrastructure and ensuring that that policy is widely distributed. So that, again, there's a need for close collaboration, back to some of the awareness campaigns that we're making, certainly for non-big players in the national infrastructure sectors in the UK. It's very important that information, as we see in this particular threat environment, is disseminated right across industry and different types of companies as well, sometimes quite a lot smaller. So therefore, we are very involved and helping to ensure that policy and what goes out through that channel is stuff that people can genuinely digest. And Reece mentioned earlier on the organisational standards, which have been recently released. There's the equivalent here, obviously NIST has recently released some stuff here, the 10 steps to cyber security. All of these things we work closely on in terms of ensuring that what actually comes out in terms of guidance is clear and can genuinely be instrumented as well. And the SANS Institute, we take the SANS Top 20 as well. So a number of different levels, I think, which work pretty well where we have that collaboration. And I would say that, pretty frankly, we are in a place where we can be quite confident that if we see something that we don't think is necessarily going to work, we have the forums that are open where we can say quite clearly that actually we think that's the wrong thing to do and there perhaps are better things to do. So I think that's the policy guidance. Then perhaps another subject completely, Mark, is about then day-to-day, how do we operate in an information sharing response type mode, which perhaps maybe you want to come on to later on. But certainly from a governance point of view, lots of touch points, lots of collaboration, which works pretty well. Thanks, Mark.
So what works well with CSTAC from my perspective is really the aspects that are operational. So to give you an example, from CSTAC we've created 2 specific working groups. One which is the Canadian Telecom Cyber Protection Working Group that deals specifically with the cyber issues. And we've got the Telecom Resiliency Working Group which deals with, I would say, more traditional business continuity, emergency management, emergency response type of issues. And one of the key successes that I see is that by having the CSTAC structure, we have representation from all of the telecom sectors across the country. So we do have a table where we can actually consult, discuss the issues. We can also make sure that these issues that need to be dealt with are driven down our organizations, but that operationally everything is basically in sync. We've seen a lot of benefits on the response side, just to significant events that we've had in the last year, Alberta floods and train derailment in Mégantic, Quebec. And those two events were key demonstrations that the networks that had been created at the executive level, but also at the very tactical operational level on the ground, were very efficient in ensuring that we had full collaboration. Nobody wondered who to call and who was going to be at the end of the line. So to me, there's a lot of benefit to that, and that is sort of often what we see as a side benefit, but it actually becomes a primary benefit when a crisis happens. So this is one of the items that I think works very well is the working group structure with a work plan. So there are deliverables, there are target dates, and there are things to accomplish. We're not just sort of discussing how we can try to save the world. Another piece that I think works fairly well is at the national level, there is a critical infrastructure strategy that has been put together. So there is, in parallel to the NSTAC, a national cross-sector forum. So basically, you could see this structure as being above NSTAC, and NSTAC as being the telecom sector-specific group, but you have one for energy, you have one for banking, and so on and so forth, similar to what we have in the UK and the US. What I think are the key good things that are happening around that forum is basically around the cross-sharing of information across sectors. So we are not only at a national level with all representatives of all critical infrastructure able to get to better planning, better understanding of interdependencies, because I think that that's one of the key points, is that interdependencies and actually understanding that quite complex equation. We've actually also in parallel started discussions with specific sectors. So often when you try to boil the ocean, it's a bit complex, but when you sort of put the telecom sector and the banking sector together in a room, you don't have too many people, and you can actually try to sort of start solving interdependencies and cross-sector issues. So these are things that we've started to do, and that we're actually seeing benefits because we are going right down to the operational level and changing some of the ways that we operate at the telecom carrier level to make sure that we can adapt and be more nimble and swift at dealing with some of the issues that we have to deal with.
Thank you, Mark. So John has agreed to sit on our panel as a U.S. representative today, but one question, it sounds like from these two comments that, not surprisingly, if you're a global carrier like yourself, that you might be working in multiple NSTAC, right? But maybe not at this level that you're at here, but is that the case? Is there engagement across lots of global boundaries and also similar to the extent or a little different?
Yeah, it's similar, I think. I think that thematically, the mission of all of these organizations and councils and committees is very similar. But as a global company, we have an obligation to follow the laws of the countries in which we do business, and then also to sort of support the interests of those countries in a manner that's appropriate regarding private and public coordination and cooperation. So, I think this is an area that is of particular interest probably to many of the members of the NSTAC, along the lines of some of the discussions that we've had historically around the evolution of technology. And so as we think about, the transition from the traditional requirements of these groups to deal with emergency response, more maintaining traditional networks, to the shift to IP, shift to cloud-based computing, the threats of cybersecurity, but also just data sovereignty issues and other things, these begin to now have other implications for these groups. And so, in the same manner, the U.S. needs to deal with these things, establish the rules of play, and then determine what is the right balance to protect private commercial interests, private customers, and then on the other side, the interests of the sovereignties. This is, I think, pretty common as well.
Okay. Questions from the floor for anybody in the panel?
I have one more. So are you all in the international landscape feeling any privacy laws or any privacy issues from some of the folks that you all deliver services to outside of your country? Part A. And then part B is, are you imposing new privacy laws or privacy policies to your other countries that you're doing business with in light of, I'll mention obviously Snowden, but just in light of the landscape, how it is today from a security posture. So, Mr. Stratton sitting next to you, have you changed your relationship at all in light of these things?
In Canada, there is a privacy law which we think is well positioned compared to other countries.
I'm sorry, is it new?
No, it's a few years old.
Okay.
I'm not in the best position to discuss with you any potential evolutions or any relationships with respect to how the ICT infrastructure is global and what we would do with our dealings with other countries. It would be unfair for me to comment on that.
Well, perhaps I should, do you want to talk about it, James? Yeah. So first and foremost, to answer the question, absolutely, there are a myriad of privacy laws, pretty well every jurisdiction, all 170 that we operate in, as I'm sure John and Mark know well, has some form of information privacy regulation, and clearly we have to comply with them. In the UK, there's a body called the Information Commissioner. It's funny, it manages its name for what it does, but that's exactly what it does do, and therefore there are rules there that are, in the UK specifically as well, linked into the overarching European privacy legislation, which clearly is the main driver behind that. So there are a number of different constructs of how those laws vary from one place to another. And clearly most importantly for us as a business, we have to respect every law that we operate in and respect and comply clearly with any regulation or law in any jurisdiction that we are in. But I sense the question was slightly going in a slightly different direction in the light of recent events and the like. Is there a renewed focus on it? I think it's quite clear and quite evident in the public domain there is much focus on privacy of information and how that impacts any one of us in this room who are involved in the various activities of providing information communication services globally. What I would say is that for BT, and I can talk clearly, obviously from our perspective, as well as complying clearly with any relevant privacy law where we operate, the need therefore to assess risk based upon those privacy laws has always been extremely important and has had even more focus to ensure that we are clear about where our data flows are, about where the handoffs between different countries are, and what types of data move and are lawfully allowed to move between different jurisdictions. And that clearly, as one of the world's leading global network carriers, is a very important issue for us, considered right at board level, and something that we spend a lot of time trying to ensure that we get right. And then beyond that, there are clearly various reporting mechanisms in place, both in the EU and in the UK more specifically, which then govern how and when reporting needs to happen as well in that space.
Scott, you have that?
Yes. So my question is, in listening to these descriptions, it sounds like there's a lot of similar parallel work going on. And I guess my question for our guests as well as for the telecom members of even the US NSTAC is that the countries represented here, the US, UK, and Canada, share a lot of common interests and often political positions, and therefore might be jointly targeted. And the question is, to what extent are the carriers sharing not within their countries, but across borders, at some of these threats to think about interdiction or response?
Sure, Mark.
So there's a couple of things that are going on. So I talked to you about CTCP, so Canadian Telecom Cyber Protection Working Group. That working group actually reaches out into the U.S. specifically, a bit less into the UK.
I meant more operationally. Like
they are very operational, very threat information and joint collaboration and operations if required. The other thing that I think is working fairly well is something that we call TSA, and it's Telecom Security Association, which actually I don't think we're allowed to say TSA, but I just did. So Telecom Security Association is a little group of chief security officers from the companies that are around the table, including Verizon, CenturyLink, AT&T, Sprint, the others, including BT. And quarterly we meet on conference calls. We have an annual meeting, and we do share the myriad of issues that we have to deal with on an ongoing basis. And outside of that, when something comes up on a Wednesday morning, pick up the phone and you basically ask, are you having this issue? How are you dealing with it? And so on. So these things are happening. I'm also seeing that there's increased information sharing from a policy framework between DHS and Public Safety Canada and the UK. I think the next step is actually to get those two parallel streams sort of overlapping, so that you get sort of everybody working at trying to deal with the same issues. So I think we've made some inroads in having these groups, working within the country, government and industry, and then industry or government across borders. But I think the next step is the integrated view of that. That's my perspective.
Thank you.
Do you have anything to add to that, Mark?
No.
No. Okay. Do you have a question?
I did. So, quick question. So, first of all, I'm Phyllis Schneck. I apologize for being late. I've been in government 8 months, and I've discovered that I no longer have control of anything. I do what I'm told. So the last time I think we met, I was in industry. So as I look from from that perspective at how we continue to grow and evolve our information sharing capabilities in DHS, as well as leveraging the resources across DHS, the Secret Service, the Coast Guard, emergency management, the whole of DHS, including our overall network in the CIO's office. What can we do more for you? And if you want to come back to me later with that, that's fine too, and I'd extend that to everyone, but especially internationally. How can we be doing this better? I know how our vision comes together on the paper now, but I will change it as we're told that it'll better inform you. So really looking for that feedback.
Okay. Perhaps I'll just say, in the UK we have recently, and perhaps James might talk about this, the Cyber Information Sharing Partnership, which has been well publicised. And what I would say on that particular point is, and perhaps the different side to the question that you asked earlier, which is where things work well. There are some things that we've tried in terms of information sharing and the like, which didn't work particularly well, and took us a bit of time to begin to work out about how we can do stuff at a more operational level that actually allows us to be able to share things between us. That means that we can respond more quickly to some of the threats that we're seeing. So I'd say the key area in this cyber information sharing partnership in the UK, which is not the response piece, the UK CERT does the response, but the CISP, as it's called. The key thing we worked out was the cross-sector. So firstly, in amongst our sector, and then sector to sector. So this is not having government facilitating, providing a framework, but actually about how we work together as carriers with other sectors, and likewise between sectors as well. And we've seen some real benefits, surprising benefits, frankly, from where one sector or another, where you wouldn't necessarily think a threat is manifesting itself in, has then suddenly popped up somewhere else, and then we're able to organise ourselves and respond better. So in response to that, I'd say, that's the industry to industry pieces that are going on are pretty important in this space and seem to be being quite fruitful.
Mm-hmm. So in the interest of mentioning some things which are not similar but different, because that might be a bit more interesting and useful, I think the UK approach to information sharing has been a bit different. We piloted an arrangement which was very sector-based, similar to the ISACs here, but actually the feedback on that was not that great. People told us that they didn't want to speak to no-hopers in their own sectors. They wanted to talk to people in other sectors from whom they felt they could learn. So the CIS, the Cyber Information Sharing Partnership, has been set up on that basis. Participants are still in charge of their own information and where that goes. They set the levels of anonymity and so on. But the system is set up to nudge them to share more broadly wherever possible. And a fusion cell composed of government people, industry experts, people from the security companies and intelligence agencies sits at the centre of this and will jog people's elbows if seeing all of the traffic they notice information that would be useful in another place. And we can tell some good war stories of how people in the pharmaceutical sector, for example, have been better protected by learning from the finance sector, who had seen off this threat some time before. We think it's working well. Don't just take my word for it. There are 400 organisations on board already. They're joining as fast as we can onboard them. Our finance sector has brought onto this platform all of its information sharing, which previously they did off their own nickel. We think this is working well, and I hope there might be a model there that you could learn from.
Any of that automated, real time?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
How much percentage-wise?
Well, it does both. There is real-time, machine-readable stuff, but there is also commentary and learning and lesson sharing on top of that from network defenders.
Thank you.
Does Canada, can you contrast how Canada does that, or is it very similar?
Well, I just want to come back to your first question, maybe, which is what can DHS do more? I have to say that again, I'm coming at it from an Industry Canada perspective, which is looking at telecom and not the overall relationship that you have with public safety. I can tell you from our perspective, we've had excellent support whenever we've come to your group and asked for assistance. The latest time was as Executive Secretary for NSTAC in Canada. We had our last session in Montreal, and we wanted perspective on your cybersecurity framework. And your team was extremely diligent in coming and presenting to us, which was very appreciated. And I know that there's an ongoing offer to help us further understand and look at what you're doing to help implement the cybersecurity framework. And so certainly the offer from your side in terms of collaboration, I think, has been excellent.
Wonderful, good to hear. Thank you.
So I had a question for that's really around cloud security. Since we have operators in government, so maybe you could start off with James on this. So the idea about the sovereignty you mentioned before, but data sovereignty, how do you think about, as the government, and then I'd be interested to hear what Mark thinks as the operator, with information moving around so freely, about where can you put a data center? Like if you want to serve the government in the UK, where is it okay to have a data center? And maybe as the operator, what does that actually feel like?
So just for clarity, my remark at the start was not about data sovereignty, but about our national sovereignty capability to detect and defeat threats, both inside government and in law enforcement, who also need the capacity to keep pace with this problem. On data sovereignty, I think we should actually hear from Mark about how this feels from
I'm sure you guys are
perspective.
Hospital pass. I mean, I think actually quite straightforward. I mean, the first thing is we have this notion often that it is not possible to deal with the fact that you can understand where your data flows are and what is happening. It is clearly quite possible to do that. And therefore, from a sovereign UK data perspective, and I wouldn't just say UK, I would say from our customers broadly, of which the UK government is a very important part, all our customers have requirements which they will put upon us in varying degrees around how they want their information handled and what the requisite controls that are required to meet their requirements. Obviously, either it's onwards their own customers or they themselves, for example, in the consumer space. And therefore, we have to obviously respect and indeed comply contractually with what is there. So specifically, there are many parts of our customer base who are quite clear about where they want their data to reside, and that is up to and including storage and data centres, and indeed where it can transit, where it can't transit, where people can access it from, who accesses it, and what level of control there is around that. And so clearly, I would say on that, as I do on that basis, that we obviously set in conjunction with our customers the required controls, we can contractually negotiate that, and then put the requisite controls in place. And all of those are entirely doable. I'm not saying that is a big issue. Having said that, to get the right controls in place for the right customers, often requires investment and indeed engineering to be able to make that happen.
Mark?
Basically the same rationale. From my perspective, I see this as simple risk management from a customer's perspective. So you've got an array of data. You've got some less sensitive. You've got some that's more sensitive. Depending on the type of data, there are some areas where you will, be less, inclined to have sort of the Fort Knox type of protection. In other areas, you will actually want to have absolute protection and also, determine where you want your data to reside. And those models exist, and it's not new. Now we call it cloud computing. It used to be, outsourcing services. It's the same thing. So you just basically need to do the proper risk assessment. And then as a carrier, of course, we offer the whole raft of solutions from, extra, ultra secured, top secret level facilities for government operations to, the other end of the spectrum, more of a sort of a public cloud type offering.
John, are you saying about like being required to locate in the United States versus being outside the United States?
Well, it's in some cases in the United States, in other cases in specific countries in Europe and Asia and elsewhere in the world. The only thing I would add to Mark and Mark's comments is that while the risk assessment is in some cases driven by the client and the specific application or value of the data, there's also increasingly regulatory pressure in industry. And so particularly healthcare and financial services sector, where country by country, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, there's a series of requirements that in some cases, individual clients or collectively have sought our assistance, and I suspect Mark's and John's and other companies around the table to help organize almost educational campaigns for regulators in those jurisdictions about the realities of how the cloud works, how data can be stored and moved and protected and the like. So there is some sector pressure here as well beyond individual clients that's also in the equation.
Mark, I would like to just add, and picking up what John just said, we also have to be quite clear as an industry, the ability for us to manage services globally and to be able to move information around globally, as long as obviously we're compliant with the client and regulatory and indeed data privacy laws, obviously that always comes first. But that said, part of the great thing about our industry is that we are able to leverage skills and capabilities globally to be able to perform a lot of our management tasks and indeed provide our services in such a way that people can gain access to services in a much more global way than they would. So I think whilst we can see that there is potentially some noise, if you want, or some clearly a sense that there should be more concentration on geography, we must also not forget that the very nature of our business as global carriers is that we do move information around compliant with laws and regulation, but there is a significant advantage to be had from being able to do that.
My government would support that as a principle. The last thing it wants to see is the Westphalianization of this space. It wants to tackle the risks in cyberspace, of course, but it wants to do that in a way which doesn't try to carve it up or lock it down.
Kevin?
Mark, I wanted to probe a question that Scott placed on the table about operational sharing and engagement. And hypothetical question, one of the major Canadian banks, Scotiabank or TD Bank, had suffered a beachhead of an incursion for several hours. How long would it take the government to become aware of it? How long would it take a U.S. carrier that also has portions of the TD Bank or Scotiabank assets in the U.S. to become aware of it? And how long did it take to complete the cycle to the U.S. government? Is that measured in hours, minutes, days?
I would say it's hours. It's not minutes. It's not days. Again, we're talking about an incident of significant importance, right? Not the everyday stuff that happens. Thank you.
Dave?
This has been a great discussion, by the way. Thank you. I tend to think about this thing in sort of three interlocking circles, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. Sort of one of the circles is this education platform, hence why I was asking about public awareness. The more we elevate knowledge of the attackers and what to do about it, the better off we are, because clearly that's just one of the pieces. The other piece is the maturation of sharing. As we get education, how quickly can we share? What kind of formats can we use to share? Assist here, a TSA, whatever word you can use there, kind of model. The third interlocking piece, I think, is really key. And I'm curious what you think about this. I think about this as upgrading the standards. How do we improve the architecture postures of our critical infrastructure from kind of where we are today, which in some cases is very legacy sort of security models, to something perhaps more modern in what you're learning and what you're educating? And is it a NIST framework kind of here in the US with some new controls? Is it something, Mark, you had mentioned a little bit, there's like a 10-step process you're using? But I think that third piece is really critical because all three need to move forward together. And if you're missing that third piece, which is recommended standards or best practices or something, we stay extremely vulnerable no matter how much education or sharing we do. And is there incentives we can put in place to upgrade? Is there de-incentives we can put in place? What kind of public policy, private interlock could we create to move the ball forward with advanced architectures? And that's key, I think, to getting ourselves improved. I'm curious if you agree. And number two, what would you do? How are you doing about that? That makes sense?
Totally agree with you. I think it is required. I think it's one of the areas that's a bit more challenging, and that's why we haven't totally figured that one out yet, I think, collectively. One thing that we did do that actually is published on Industry Canada's website, so it's public, we, across the telecom operators in Canada, we agreed on security best practices for telecom operators. So we basically, it does touch about network architecture, it does touch the issues of monitoring and detection and incident response and like the whole raft of security considerations and controls that should be in place. Of course, going forward, because the challenge is, retrofitting that to legacy systems is, quite a challenge. So I think we have started down that path. Certainly, one of the areas of focus that we all need to pay more attention to. But I think your reflection is, do we need more of that? I think yes, we do, and we've started down that path.
I think there's a room here, I think, to inject a little bit of the cybersecurity framework that comes out of our executive order. I know we've talked to each of your governments about this. What came out of that is that the framework, phase one, it's a growing document, it's dynamic, it'll keep changing with you. But phase one was closed on February 12th of this year, and with that launched the Homeland Security program. We call it the Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity Community Volunteer Program. And what that means is we have offered all the resources of DHS that look at critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity on the website, talking to people, et cetera, measurements, as high-level guidance with the framework to have markets, first of all, secure the companies and have the bigger companies help the smaller companies to whom you connect to get more secure and to adhere to your standards when they connect to you. But also looking at requests for information to the small to medium, as was mentioned earlier, to help them get to better security standards. They make up, at least in this country, 99% of our business fabric and are woefully lack security. But looking at how markets, Dave, to your point, are going to drive this. How can companies come in, big or small, and invent the next great technology that's less expensive but better that helps defeat this adversary? And I think that framework can help us do that from a policy perspective and a technology one.
So one other question was something timely. We're going to hear from Glenn shortly, but we have a subcommittee studying right now the idea of, for lack of a better term, the mobilization of IT assets in the event of a true cyber emergency. And what that means is government and industry working together to bring to bear combined resources, not just threat intelligence sharing, but combined maybe physical operational resources to do something about that. Do you have anything at all like that, or been thinking about anything along those lines?
Yes. So the UK government has a national incident management policy for cyber, a set of arrangements for what we would do if the evil day came and we had a major cyber-driven incident in the UK. These arrangements have not been tested in anger, I'm pleased to say, but they are based on a long and sad experience of terrorist incidents and other resilience issues in the UK, so we are confident that they're reasonably robust. But they are not yet as connected as they need to be to the arrangements of the critical national infrastructure providers who would be the people hit in an emergency and whose responses and arrangements clearly need to be well coordinated with ours. So in order to deal with that, we have set up a new organisation, CERT UK, a national CERT, whose main job is to reach out to the national infrastructure and make sure that we and they are inside one another's heads, understand absolutely how our respective responses will work, so we are not practicing out for the first time for real in the middle of an emergency. It's running a big exercise program with the critical national infrastructure sectors. There was a big exercise in our banking sector, but for example, before Christmas, we really think we need to be prepared, and this CERT UK organisation sits at the heart of our mobilisation effort.
And where does that live? Where does that organisation live inside the big?
So CERT UK is an agency of the government. It reports to the Cabinet Office where I work, but it is not just a government organisation. It has industry secondees and partners in it. It hosts, by the way, this cyber information sharing platform I mentioned, and this fusion cell with industry secondees in it. So it is absolutely a joint body, not just a government one, though we host and pay for it.
Are you part of that?
Yes.
I would assume. Is it?
Absolutely.
And does that work?
Yep.
Very well?
We were right in the middle of the exercise that James was referring to before Christmas for the banking sector, and we are right in the middle of the CERT UK and SIST function.
The CERT UK's other job, of course, is to reach out to other international CERTs and make sure that the UK is holding its end up in that international discussion. It has a strong and burgeoning relationship with the NKIC here, and we look forward to cooperating with them.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank
Do you have anything
I'll
similar?
let Mark comment. We have a similar effort in Canada.
Canadian Cyber Incident Response Center is basically the model, not as evolved, I think, from a fusion center perspective, which are things that are being looked at, but certainly the central point for all critical infrastructures, the central hub for coordinating efforts, also international. So the linkages are there, and when things operationally need to happen, that's where they're coordinated to. So we do have a central body that every critical infrastructure sector goes to.
Okay, interesting. Good. Okay. Other questions, comments from the floor? The last one I had then was I would be interested, or maybe folks would be interested to hear about right now with all that's going on with various, I'll call it post-Snowden events, in the U.S. I think lots of folks in this industry or different industries in the United States are feeling pressure outside the United States from working with companies outside the United States or even governments outside the United States. I wonder if you have any of that going on from a UK perspective of what's the environment or attitude, post all this for UK and then Canadian business working outside your own borders.
Well, I think, as I said before, we need to comply obviously with any law and any privacy, which we do, which is absolutely at the heart of what we do in every shape or form. I think there are many discussions going on in many governments around the globe at the moment about how they approach their privacy and those types of things. And clearly, as that evolves, one thing I would say as an operator, and I'm sure many others around the room will share my view, is that clarity is very important. Clarity in law, clarity in policy, to enable us to be clear and how to challenge as well. So clarity about how we challenge and push back as well is very important to us to ensure that we first and foremost safeguard our customers' privacy and comply with any laws or regulation where we operate.
Anything to add that, Mark? Or?
I think Mark hit the nail on the head. I think the clarity issue is the one that's most urgent to tackle.
I'm not sure everybody could hear you down there, yeah.
I was saying I think the clarity issue that Mark was talking to is the key point that needs to be tackled in this field.
Any other questions for our folks?
Could we have everyone talk a little bit about their response to Heartbleed? I know we had some remarks on that, and it'd be interesting to hear the other perspectives as well.
Heartbleed.
So, I mean, I'd start by saying let's use what we've been talking about. We've been talking about CISP. So, firstly, CISP was involved in the information sharing partnership we've spoken about already, in terms of helping to disseminate the fact that the vulnerability existed around the UK. So, CERT UK was instrumental in doing that. You know, and that was important in terms of being able to do it. So, my first point, I would say, from our own perspective as a carrier, and indeed the customers that we have. Is that, you know, being able to understand what the risk was to us as a business, and to indeed and our customers being able to do that, further again reinforce the fact that in amongst a lot of what we do, the NIST standards and the rest of it, right at the top of that always sits the ability to be able to assess risk, understand the criticality of various parts of the infrastructure that you're running in any particular enterprise, be it my enterprise and BT, or indeed other customers that we have, and then being able to then respond to that. And that all sits there as one of the key underpinning themes of any set of standards, that without that, being able to respond, you're going to be hampered in your response to be able to doing that. So I would say, in firstly, the mechanisms we've been talking about certainly helped in terms of getting the response going, but then the work that we had done in BT and being guided, if you want, in the UK more broadly by the push for the organisational standards, certainly helped that we had spent time ensuring that we understood where our critical infrastructure was, having the right parts of that infrastructure covered, so we could then begin to remediate. The actual remediation is a very serious event, clearly, Heartbleed. The actual remediation, once you'd identified what needed to be remediated, that could then take place and be done as timely as it could be. So I would say that it reinforced, I think, the Heartbleed situation reinforced the need for understanding what's critical, sharing information to be able to ensure that we start mobilising quickly, and also helping to dispel. There was some confusion, as we know, quite early on in the incident around to patch, not patch, or, well, clearly we all had to patch, but what was the guidance around password resetting, all these sort of things. So I think actually the response that we had helped to get clarity much more quickly than perhaps we would have done before some of these mechanisms were in place. But I suppose the final point on Heartbleed is just back to what I was saying, that really a lot of it came down to actually not a lot to do with a security thing per se. Understanding infrastructure, understanding how you manage risk within any enterprise is good basic discipline, regardless of indeed the event that you're dealing with.
I mean, basically same answer. I would just add that I think the key element for us was asset management. So as long as you have a very robust asset management structure within your organization, you can deal with these things swiftly. If you don't, then you're just spinning your wheels and running around trying to figure out where your problem is, and that's where it becomes complicated. So I guess the key learning for anybody that doesn't have a very robust asset management structure, it is sort of the key elements of good hygiene.
John, you anything on Heartbleed? Okay, we're about to the end of our time for the panel, so I'd like to thank the panelists for being with us today and taking time, and turn it over to Michael if you have any comments for us. At the end there.
Well, thank you, and I apologize for being late. I got all the way to the West Wing. And they, as Phyllis said, you're no longer in charge of your schedule. But I wanted to say thank you to all of the folks for the discussion on the panel. I think it highlights a couple of things that I think are very much emerging themes in this space. One of which is the continuing need for developing new forms of public-private interaction in this space. Oftentimes we think of the relationship between the government and the private sector as either being contractual, we're buying a service or a product, or regulatory. And clearly the cybersecurity partnership that we're trying to build is neither of those, and certainly doesn't fit either of those very cleanly. So the need to develop those new kinds of partnerships that are being, some of which are being piloted in the UK or in Canada, some here in the United States, we all need to be learning from those as we build those new kinds of partnerships, because that's what we're going to need in the long term to tackle the cybersecurity problem. I would say the other thing that it highlights is the continuing need for additional mental models in this space.
that a lot of what we've been talking about is, and Phyllis and I have a lot of these discussions about the need to create, in effect, the National Weather Service for cyberspace. The ability to generate that kind of information that everyone can consume, so that everyone can have the situational awareness they need in cyberspace. Or the ability to have the ecosystem have effectively an immune system so that it can respond much more rapidly and effectively to threats, to undermine the business model of the criminals and the malware developers. So I think all of the things that we've been talking about today are the development of those new kinds of structures that we're working towards to tackle the cybersecurity threat that we face. And I think that it's these kinds of discussions are exactly what we need in order to actually do that. So, and the last thing I would say is that I think it continues to show the value of the efforts that we've put into things like the cybersecurity framework and the flexibility that framework actually brings to the discussion and the way that it enables that discussion to happen on a risk basis, the language that all of you in the private sector particularly speak, sort of managing risk and managing cybersecurity in that risk context, which I think is very important. So again, thank you for the discussion. It was very useful.
Appreciate it. Hopefully not the last one we can have. Okay, so we're a little ahead of schedule because we had to drop something from the agenda, but I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Schneck, who, without putting you on the spot, but it's your turn. So we're going to hear from some of the updates from previous NSTAC studies.
This is my first meeting since joining government that ran ahead of schedule, so I'm just doing that.
Don't tell Maggie.
Please tell me, if you can't hear me in the back, please tell me. It's the room structure. So one of the things I took away from the last meeting was the desire of the group to hear more detail on the recommendations that were made in the past and what we had done with them. That was after I'd been in government for 2 months. So now after 8 months, the team has given an entire readout of where we've been with recommendations from about 3 years ago and up to now. This is likely one of the most important things that we do because it's how we look at what we learn here, which is why we're here, to learn from you, and then close out on what we're doing with that and get your guidance on if that worked. So I'll just start with the first one. If you look at the recommendation on the report to the President on the communications resiliency, actually I'm going to start with terrorist attacks. So the first scenario we got was the multiple terrorist attacks in the National Capital Region. The request was that Congress fund the Department of Homeland Security's priority services efforts to continue industry and government collaboration and ensure that advanced NSEP, or National Security Emergency Preparedness, communication services are operational when needed. This predates me, but it closed out. And the administration did request that funding over the past 4 years for NSEP communication services, and they are operational and when needed. And for the past 2 years, it's been funded, and we'll continue to encourage that funding. I can tell you, having spent 5 times on the Hill now, at least in the past 6-7 weeks, we ask for money a lot. It's for good things like this, but no guarantees, but we are pushing that. So that recommendation was taken and closed out. The next was encourage DHS to file comments with the FCC in its appropriate public safety broadband dockets, and DHS should recommend that the FCC continue working closely with industry as it builds the nationwide interoperable public safety mobile broadband network, as recommended in the FCC's National Broadband Plan, and that was done. And where appropriate, we partner with other federal agencies. We file comments with the FCC. Our Science and Technology, or says our R&D Directorate, is working with NIST and industry to develop requirements and standards for a new broadband network. For those who are familiar with FirstNet, I see a couple of faces in the room that are very familiar and encouraging with this. This is the emergency network fabric for emergency responders, all state-of-the-art, from spectrum to devices, and our Office of Emergency Communications, which rolls up to me, is working heavily on that. And earlier this week, I chaired the meeting of the Emergency Communications Preparedness Center, which coordinates between us and the Executive Committee that regulates the wrong word here, but that drives that. So really working hard on that because, look, cybersecurity is, we talk a lot about information sharing. I was in an exercise with another sector a few months ago, and we looked at everybody telling everybody how they shared all kinds of information, how it was going very well and they were all ready. When asked the question, what happens if your comms go out? That was a whole afternoon. So that is just as important as locking down the bad guys, is making sure that we can talk and communicate, because that's why we're here. So number 3 was encourage DHS to petition the FCC to issue a declaratory ruling to confirm that network service providers may lawfully offer IP-based priority access services to NSEP authorized users. And the FCC's CISRIC 2010 report, I know many in your companies are on that committee with the FCC. That report for planning with the NSEP Next-Gen Network Priority Services during pandemic events addresses this need to establish emergency communications priority through IP-based services. And the report highlights the need for development of NSEP priority services on next-gen network and specifically recommends that the government enable network operators to expedite their development of NSEP priority services. I know how hard that is in IP-based services, so that is not lost on us. But that is still in progress, looking at that. Number 4, and I can go through these if the group would like, or I can give you the whole readout.
Yeah, how many do you have?
Well, the group gave me this to show that we took every recommendation to heart and acted on it. So there are about 5 more. Does the group have this summary?
I don't think we were given this one.
I'm going to go over it faster for you. But basically encouraging us to continue funding our research, R&D in interoperability and emergency communications, which I can tell you we are doing. Direct DHS to build further alerting capabilities that consider all potential multi-platform technologies. That will also come up in FirstNet. So again, as we drive that through DHS in this very modern first responder network, you will see some of that. To accelerate efforts to fulfill our National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center mission, and that's fully operational by the 2015 timeframe. Just a show of hands, how many have gotten to visit our NKIC? I would encourage those who have not, I would welcome you there. I think it's fully operational now. This is where we do our responses. You have 24/7 folks that are constantly getting injects from our partners, our stakeholders, people that don't even know us, other countries. We talk to 200 CERTs, interagency partners, and it's a cycle, rinse, lather, repeat. We are constantly getting those injects. We are constantly looking at what that means and disseminating information out as widely as possible across federal civilian government, state, local, tribal, territorial, and across the critical infrastructure. I can tell you firsthand, sometimes those guys are exhausted, guys and gals, but it is a 24/7 operation that we're looking to make even better. And I'd invite you to come see that. Catastrophic earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area. So all of these are looking at how we looked at exercises. So look at directing the rapid expansion of personnel and resources, accelerate efforts. So all of that is being looked at. I would consider that one closed out, given the direction it was gone. And then direct FEMA in coordination with DHS agencies and Department of Defense to identify, support, and integrate relevant tactical emergency comms to support capabilities across the federal government. So we are working very, very closely with them, and they coordinate with NCS as well as other interagency partners. So we, again, since I've been here, have been lucky to have a great relationship with our CIO office. So imagine what a sweet target DHS.gov is. So we are learning from them as well as the other parts of DHS. So FEMA included, but also Coast Guard, Secret Service, Homeland Security Investigation, and the whole of department effort. We were asked to develop and test the National Cyber Incident Response Plan and proceeding to implement the additional stages of the NKIC, which we are doing, as I mentioned. That was done. We were asked to get the appropriate government certification and accreditation process, such as the DFAR and the Defense Information Assurance Certification accreditation process, to verify the existence of vendor diversity when acquiring equipment and when operating and installing a network. And that was done. And looking at what we do to develop out-of-band networks, and this came up in another context the other day, that's actually being studied. So we referred that to OSTP for consideration. We've also asked, we were directed by the OSTP in coordination with DoD and DHS to establish a single forum for ongoing tech and policy dialogue between government and key industry service providers. And we referred that back to OSTP as well, Office of Science and Technology Policy here in the White House. And finally, direct DHS to institute an expanded program of national level exercises that include government agencies and infrastructure providers. Again, this one's about 2 years old as well. So NLE 12, National Level Exercise 12, and the cyber exercises, all were results of that. That's closed out. And encourage OMB, those who provide our money, the Office of Management and Budget, to continue funding for federal departments and agencies' development of security enhancements within the core infrastructure. And that's been closed out. We are happy to go into much more detail with these. I bring you all of this because last time we didn't give you enough of these. and we're happy to follow up, but I wanted to make sure you know that going back 4 years, which long predates me, we went back and hunted down everything that was recommended to us and wanted you to know that it was absolutely imperative that we meet that. So any follow-up, please make sure we get that, and we'll give you lots of detail.
Thank you. Any questions?
Next time you ask for something, remember to look at answer.
Mark?
Yes.
Architect, first thing, thank you for the feedback. I think that's one of the kind of recurring themes that we've had in this group, that we present recommendations and then with long gaps or no feedback that we get, that certain things are being acted upon, and I think that's a very exhaustive and comprehensive list of what's done. Having said that, with a very comprehensive list, as I was trying to listen intently in an acoustically challenged room, can you give us your subjective view of whether it made a difference and you're better off for having done all that?
So I've been here 8 months, and I may defer to others who were here when most of these were made. I have seen in my private sector time, which was all my career until then, I've seen the NKIT grow immensely in the past, say, 3 years. I've seen the National Exercise Program grow immensely in 3 years between Cyberstorm and the different national level exercises, which involve all the different areas of government. I've seen a lot more coordination across the different areas of DHS. So it's not just about cybersecurity and communications, it's about critical infrastructure and why we do cybersecurity. It's about ensuring we have secure communications, which is actually why we do cybersecurity. It's about working tightly with our law enforcement partners within DHS, with Secret Service and Homeland Security investigations, as well as outside with the FBI or the intelligence community. And I've seen that really grow, not only in my time here, but over the past 3 years. And there are some in here who can speak to this. When I was in private sector, I shared as much as I could with DHS because I watched that improvement. And so I think, having read through these about a week ago with Helen, I think a lot of that has been at least sparked by this group. Is that? Yeah.
And I would just add on to that. So, for example, in terms of like the report on secure government communications, we have been using that report quite liberally inside the Executive Office of the President to, as a core example of an outside analysis that shows why we actually need to change the way the federal government does business in managing our own IT security. I regularly hold that up as an example of why we actually need to make progress in this space. And it's actually driving some of our thinking and has contributed greatly to the proposals that we're putting on the table as a result of that. I can't tell you which of those specific ones have come to fruition yet because they haven't, but it certainly is contributing to, contributing materially to the conversation and helps make the persuasive case of why we've actually can't just continue doing business as usual. Just as one other example.
Any other questions for Phyllis? Thanks for the update. I know to Clay's point, I think lots of things get talked about here, and this list was broader than the NSTAC list, but it's always nice to see what actually happens with that. So look forward to further updates. Great. Okay. Well, then we're going to move on to 2 business items here. Next, we're going to introduce Bill Swanson, who chairs our Internet of Things subcommittee. And I understand since we last met, there's been a lot of briefings for the subcommittee. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Bill now so he can deliver his remarks on how that effort's gone. So.
Hey, Mark, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and those that heard me earlier this morning, I apologize. I'm pleased to update you on the Internet of Things Research Subcommittee. My co-chair, Steve Bennett, is no longer on the committee, yet I'd like to acknowledge his contributions to NSTAC and the IoT subcommittee this far, and we wish him well in future endeavors. As you may recall, at the member conference call on 19 February, we reached out on the Internet scoping report, and the vote was established that the Internet of Things Research Subcommittee to examine the cyber implications of IoT within the context of national security and emergency preparedness. And on 6 March, we conducted a brief kickoff meeting, and we began regular subcommittee meetings starting on 13 March. We're approximately halfway through the period that we've set aside to receive briefings from SMEs and organizations to gain insight on applicable technical issues, intelligence threat information, and general lessons learned and best practices. We've heard from a number of speakers from various organizations, both government and industry, and some of the organizations that have provided the briefing. And I want to thank Phyllis, the Department of Homeland Security, S&T, IS and CERT, General Electric, Cisco, Joint Program Office for NSCP Communications, the Executive Committee, and the DoD Cybersecurity Office and GSA, just to mention a few. And we have more scheduled for the summer. So far, the sessions have included discussions on cyber physical systems security, interoperable NSCP communications architecture, security threats and measures, and architectural security. Since we're just in our second month, the actual research phase, the subcommittee has not really developed a list of findings yet. However, a number of observations are beginning to emerge. Most commonly observed is the fact that the rapid rate of technology innovation associated with the internet is really outpacing security solutions required to protect them. No surprise. We've also observed what appears to be a trend towards the convergence of what we call operational technology, or OT, and information technology, IT. Additionally, there seems to be a lack of R&D focus on the intersection between cyber and the physical domains to ensure understanding of the positive and negative implications. There is a sizable difference in potential consequences of an execution command failure between OT systems, such as those running industrial control systems, versus traditional IT systems. The way to think about it is a failure of an industrial control system can have a catastrophic impact the life and safety of many, whereas a failure of a traditional IT system may be disruptive, yet it's really not catastrophic. These are just a few of the initial observations based on what we've heard thus far from subject matter experts and organizations who are engaged in the issue. The briefings combined with an active subcommittee discussions have been very beneficial. We expect to learn more as we continued with scheduled briefings through the end of June. In July, the subcommittee will begin synthesizing the data, writing and coordinating our draft report to be presented in the November meeting. In closing, the subcommittee still has a lot of work to do, yet the effort remains on schedule and on track to report out in November. And we appreciate everybody's support around the table. You've all been great, and we'll provide another update on our conference call in August. And that concludes my report, Mr.
Thanks,
Chairman.
Bill. I appreciate that. And thanks for leading the subcommittee. Are there any questions on the effort for Bill?
Do you need our help in any way, Bill? You guys?
I would just say if you've got concerns or things that you think about in your company that cover both the, what I'd say, OT and IT, send them in. We'll take a look at it. It's a big task.
It is.
It's like boiling the ocean, the way I call it. But I think we're going to be able to have some recommendations.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
How did you end up defining the Internet of Things? Like, I know that was one of the very early issues you're dealing with. You have a short version of what does it mean?
By consensus.
Okay. Okay.
There are a lot of ways to do it, and it seemed to be the most widely accepted, that people would hear it and they'd understand that it is a bunch of things connected to the network that in a way that some of us are going to have no control over. And it's going to gather vast amounts of data that we're eventually going to have to figure out what we're going to do with them.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Glenn Post, the NSTAC co-chair for our Information Technology Mobilization Scoping Subcommittee. Other co-chair Renee James from Intel is unable to make it today, but she's contributed as well. And I think, as we know, Michael presented this tasking to us back in November of 2013 at the last meeting in November 2013, and asked that the NSTAC examine and describe the needs, benefits, operational efficacy of a national IT mobilization capability in the face of a major cyber attack or massive cyber attack. So, Glenn, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Since February, we've received substantial government briefings on existing plans, exercises, programs, policies associated with this effort. We've used this time to determine the best way to really undertake this project. We've learned that substantial progress has been made to better coordinate within the government itself. And also significant strides have made to reduce the barrier to government from sharing information with the private sector. We do know there's still ways to go there, but we haven't seen progress there. Despite this progress, we don't have the means to quickly and effectively coordinate government industry capabilities if we were to have a really major attack. The cyber exercises have reinforced the need to better understand, identify the resources and capabilities we need to respond quickly and effectively. And we have to develop the means to effectively coordinate the assets that we have with government and industry. And we have to clarify the roles of authority within government and industry for the attack, during, and after. So we have it's a monumental task, actually. There's a lot to do here to get all this coordinated. Both industry and government will need to enhance our respective response capabilities. We have to ensure effective collaboration and coordination among industry partners, as well as between industry and government. In discussion with our briefers, we've consistently heard that government would like to better understand the kind of response options and capabilities that industry has. They want to receive private sector corroboration of threats. Government wants to receive private sector assessment of the potential consequence of the threats. They want to know the private sector's current posture and their ability to handle threats. And they want to know what the private sector might expect, what we might request or need from the government to address major threats. As we move from the scoping phase of this project to the research phase, we hope to answer some of those questions in greater detail. We hope to answer all of them, but we'll get as many as we can. During the next phase, we propose to focus first on current industry practices and recommend ways private industry can enhance our mutual cyber response capabilities. What can we do among ourselves first? Secondly, building upon those practices, we will then focus on that intersection between the public and private sectors. We're engaging with the government for support, collaboration, or coordination can better enable the collective private sector response. Finally, we'll consider whether there's a threshold and private sector response to a major cyber event may need to be more government directed, as we've discussed in recent meetings. Renee and I intend to deliver a final report in November for NSTAC approval. The recommendations made will reflect the global environment we operate within, while also we have to recognize that NSTAC really supports the national security and emergency preparedness needs of the United States. I would like to thank Helen Jackson and Sue Dodge with the DHS Advisory Council Management Branch, as well as Adam Bolova and Rick Harris from the Operational Planning Exercises and Training Integration Unit of the NCCIC, or NCIC. And these individuals have been instrumental in the progress we've made thus far. I'd also like to thank the NSTAC members who provided interim guidance to the subcommittee in developing this report. We believe NSTAC's continued study will serve as a catalyst in advancing our nation's collective cyber response capabilities. Does anyone of the members have questions, comments on this at this point?
Great, okay. Thank you.
I move that NSTAC establish a subcommittee to study response, coordination, and managing a cyber-related event of national significance. Approve the NSTAC will produce a report to the President that will describe the needs, benefits, and operational efficiencies of the national ICT response coordination capability.
Here, a second on that?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried. Okay. Thank you, Glenn, and Renee, if you'd pass along our thanks to Renee as well for the work so far. We look forward to hearing more about the report at our August meeting. Great. Okay, so don't tell Maggie, but we're way ahead. We're going to end early. So I'd like to thank everybody for your time today, especially the folks who joined us from government, especially our international guests as well, who came a long way to be with us. Ask if you have any closing comments, Michael? Or?
No, I just wanted to say thank you all for coming. The administration really does. I personally benefit, but the administration as a whole benefits from your insight, your perspective. It really does help shape our thinking. It really does matter. I am also very much aware that all of you have real jobs actually running companies, and so we very much appreciate you taking the time out of that, out of your schedule to come in and talk with us. It really is quite beneficial. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks again, Bill and Glenn and Renee. Our next meeting is a conference call that's going to be held on August 13th. So if you don't have it on your calendars yet, please get that on there. I'll send a note out later to remind folks along with the time. And with that, I'll ask you, any other comments from any members? If not, meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.